Welcome! This time on WoodWorks, we'll show you how to build this great blanket chest made out of walnut and purple heart. Stay with us. Hi, I'm David Marks. Welcome to WoodWorks. The blanket chest that we're going to be building this time features a beautiful frame and panel lid with purple heart for the frame and some unusually figured walnut that's been shaped into a raised panel and has a rich three-dimensional profile. In addition, we use purple heart on the base with an arts and crafts style step motif. The sides for this blanket chest come together with dovetail joints, which add strength as well as a decorative touch. We'll start this project by making the sides and the dovetail joinery. For our blanket chest, we're going to need some 14-inch wide stock for the sides. Now, it's not too likely that you're going to walk into your local lumber yard and find some boards that are that wide. So, here's what you need to do. You need to plan on gluing two boards of walnut together, like we did here. And I'm going to go ahead and wet this with a cloth. And this will really illustrate the color and the figure of the wood. So what we're looking for is we need to color match the grain and the figure, especially around the joint line, so that we end up with one wide board that has a sense of uniformity to it. This will give our blanket chest a sense of harmony. Now, we've already glued some stock up for the sides. We've scraped the excess glue off. We've left them a little bit long. So our first step is we're going to go ahead and cut these to length. We're getting ready to cut the dovetails for our blanket chest. Now, the dovetail joint is actually the strongest joint known to woodworkers. It's also the most aesthetically pleasing. Let's take a look at it. We have our pins and we have our tails. Now, the tails are actually in the shape of a dove's tail. Hence, there's actually some logic to the name of these woodworking joints. Now, traditionally, these joints were cut by hand. But we're going to use a dovetail jig and a router because it's a whole lot easier. Now, the way it works is like this. We've got a dovetail bit set up in the router and a collar, and that's going to rub inside of our dovetail template and cut out perfect dovetail joints every time. Now, it's important to remember also, before you do your actual cut on the stock of wood that you're going to use for your project, to go ahead and use a scrap piece of wood to do your test cuts. That could save you some money in the long run. So, let's not forget to use our safety equipment and go ahead and make our cuts. We've already cut the dovetails in the long sides of our blanket chest. Now we flip the jig and we're setting up to cut the pins in the short sides. For the router, we've already changed our dovetail bit to a straight bit, and that's what we're going to use to cut the pins. We're just doing a dry fit for the case for our blanket chest. Now what we want to do is double check and just make sure that all these dovetails go together. And as you can see, we've got a really nice fit. Now this is a good opportunity to go ahead and lay out for our rabbet, which we're going to cut along the bottom of our case for our plywood panel, which will drop in later on. Now once we've finished laying out for that, we can take the case over to the router table and cut the rabbet. For the glue up of our case, we're using a slow setting urea resin-based glue. This will give us about an hour of working time and greatly reduce that whole anxiety and stress associated with a complicated glue up. Now you can see over here, we've already gone ahead and tapped our sides together. Now this gives us plenty of room to go ahead and brush the glue inside of our dovetails, but this way we don't have to wrestle or fight with this thing when it comes time to assemble it. We've also put some blue masking tape here, so when we clamp this thing together, that's going to capture the squeeze out and greatly reduce the cleanup. Because this glue will need about 8 to 12 hours to dry, it's a good idea to check that the clamps are tight and the corners are square before you let it set. The case for our blanket chest has sat overnight and the glue is nice and dry. Now next up, we're going to go ahead and work on this rabbet. Now earlier, we did a stop rabbet with a router so that we wouldn't cut through the sides of these dovetails. Now, we're going to come back with a nice sharp chisel and go ahead and chop these corners square for our panel that's going to sit into the bottom. Now after we're done chopping this out, we'll use a belt sander to clean up the glue and flush up these corners. Once the rabbet is squared up, we can glue the plywood panel into the rabbet at the bottom of our blanket chest. Next, we'll start work on the base for our blanket chest. This is our case for our blanket chest. And this is our Purple Heart base. Now Purple Heart is the only wood in the world that has this natural purple color to it. For this base, we use miters in the four corners and biscuits for the joinery. Then on this inside edge, we've cut a rabbet all the way around the top of the base for our case to drop into and fit securely. Now to start building the base, we'll start at the table saw, and first we'll cut our miters and our rabbets, and then we'll cut our biscuits. We set the saw blade at a 45-degree angle to cut the miters. Next, we reset the table saw and cut the rabbet. First on the face of our stock, then on the side. And on the mitered ends of our frame, we cut the slots for the number 10 biscuits with a biscuit cutter. We're using this template to go ahead and draw our profile onto our base. Now this design, this is called a step motif. And it's this step motif that's going to give that arts and crafts style feel to our blanket chest. Now our first step is to go ahead and rough cut the profile on our bandsaw. Here's our rough cut left behind by the bandsaw. Now, we've double stick taped our template back on top. Why? We're over here at the router table with this special setup to do a process called profile cutting. Here's how it works. We've got a spiral carbide router bit with some bearings at the top. Now those bearings are going to follow along our template, and the cutters will cut away the rough fibers left by the bandsaw. This will leave you with a smooth surface and save you a tremendous amount of time. After cleaning up the profile with some 220 grit sandpaper, we round off the sharp edges on the router table with an 1/8 inch radius bit. For the glue up, we use a band clamp to pull the miters and biscuits of our base in tight. This is a rough slab of California walnut. Now, we've already done a little bit of hand planing, and it's starting to show some of the color and figure that we're looking for the top of our blanket chest. Now this is a board that we've already cut from a sister slab. Now we've jointed and planed the surface, and it's revealed exactly what we're looking for. Some beautiful burl and curl figure down here, and some really rich chocolate and purpley swirly grain patterns, which, when we resaw it, is going to give us a spectacular book match panel for the top of our blanket chest. We join a flat surface, then use the bandsaw to cut our panel stock in half. This will expose the matching grain patterns. After some sanding, we glue the boards together to make a panel wide enough to cover our blanket chest. We're cutting our miters for our frame for the top of our blanket chest. We have got a really great miter jig. Now this thing works on a very simple principle. This fence is set up at a perfect 90-degree corner. Now the way that it works is like this. We cut one side of our frame on this side of the jig, and then we cut our matching side of the frame on this side of the jig. Now these are going to come together at a perfect 90-degree corner every time. With the miters cut on all four corners, we use the biscuit cutter to make slots for number 10 biscuits that will hold our frame together. Next, on the table saw, we cut a dado in the frame stock to house the figured walnut panel. Then, on the router table, we use a cove bit to add some nice concave detail to the inside edges of the frame. Here's our frame and panel lid for our blanket chest. Now one of the really outstanding features of this is this raised panel design. It really gives it that three-dimensional feel. Now you know how you're always looking for an easier way to do things? We are going to actually show you how to do a raised panel in just 2 cuts. Now first, we're going to use a core box bit at the router table with our fence set at 1.25 inches. We'll plow through here, and that's going to give us this concave surface on the inside edge. Then we come over here to the table saw, we stand our panel up, and we raise the blade and saw through to that inside concave edge. That gives us our raised panel in just 2 cuts. Now that we've got the shaping on our panel, we're ready to glue it into our frame. Now we'll finish up the case and add some hinges. We've already put some glue in the rabbet of our Purple Heart base. Now we're getting ready to glue our case down into our base. What's important here is that we get some good downward clamping pressure. So for that, we're going to use these cauls. Now we'll go ahead and set these on top of the case and use some clamps to clamp these down to our assembly table. That's going to give us the downward force that we need. Our frame and panel lid is all glued up. Now we've already done some sanding on it, and because it's the lid to our blanket chest, this thing's going to get open and closed quite a bit. Now these edges are still pretty sharp. So we're going to go ahead and use the radius bit and go all the way around the frame, round those over, and soften that edge, and that'll give it a much more friendly feel to the fingers. Took about 2 hours for the glue to dry on our base. We're just finishing chiseling out the mortise for our hinge. We've got a really good quality hinge for our lid. This has got a really nice feature to it. That's this positive stop mechanism. The way it works is when we go ahead and open the lid up, that positive stop will hold the lid open. You see this block of wood clamped to the back of our blanket chest? This helps tremendously for using the plunge router to route out our mortises. If you try to balance this router on the side of the blanket chest by itself, you can see it's way too tipsy and it doesn't feel safe. But by clamping this block of wood on here, this gives us a good solid base for making our cut. We've cut the mortises in our case, and now we're getting set up to cut the mortises for our hinges in our lid. We've already laid out where they're going to go, and because the fence in our router is in the same position that it was for cutting the mortises in the case, it's going to give us the width we need for cutting the mortises in our lid. Once the mortises in our lid are made, we can attach it to our base and finish up our blanket chest. Just put in the last couple of screws to attach our lid to our blanket chest. Now it's a good idea to use a little bit of wax on the threads of your screws when you're screwing into a hard wood. This is especially true when you're working on a really dense wood like Purple Heart. So go ahead and get this cinched down. Check our fit. And our positive stop hinges are working really nice to hold the lid up. Now that we've got the hinges screwed into place real nicely, we've got to go ahead and take them back off so that we can put the finish on. We're using a finish that's a blend of tung oil and linseed oil. This really soaks into the wood and brings out some rich colors. You can really see the vibrancy of the grain patterns. It will take about 4 or 5 coats of tung oil to finish our blanket chest, with a rub down between each coat. For the tung oil to cure properly, we should let each coat dry overnight. Now that our finish is complete, we're reattaching our brass hinges. You know that oil finish that we put on earlier? It really soaked deeply into the wood, and you can see how it allows those rich colors of the Purple Heart and the Walnut to shine through. The finish also accentuates the dovetails, adding a light and dark contrast to the corners. The figured walnut on the lid has produced rich colors and swirling patterns that flow within the Purple Heart frame. This blanket chest mixes the best of both contemporary and classic styles into a piece with unique beauty. Our blanket chest only needs one last thing: some blankets. I'm David Marks. We'll see you right here next time on WoodWorks.